Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we'll be discussing about the emerging challenges which are being faced by the Indian cities and what has been the government's response to that in the light of the World Cities Day which was held recently on the 31st of October. Then in the second topic, we'll be taking up a very interesting discourse where we'll try to examine that how the ideas of Buddhism can be integrated into the soft power tool by India's foreign diplomacy. Then from your simplified section, we'll be taking up 5 news where we'll not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide the very important value addition and practice questions, keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2025. So stay tuned. The article today highlights the growing challenges which are actually being faced by the Indian cities due to the issue of unplanned urbanization in the light of the World Cities Day which was actually held recently on October 31st. And these issues being faced by Indian cities forms an important component of your GS1 paper under the theme of issues related to urbanization and the remedies which shall be taken. So let's first try to understand the context of the news. Recently, on 31st of October, there was World Cities Day, which was actually held as passed by the United Nations General Assembly through a resolution 68 by 239. So basically, if a day has to be celebrated, there is a resolution which is passed by UNGA. The idea is that now currently the world's urban population has actually reached to a staggering number of 4.7 billion, which basically forms the 57.5% of the total population, and this urban population is actually going to get double by the year of 2050. The theme of this year's World Cities Day was what? It was basically youth climate change makers, catalyzing the local action for urban sustainability. The idea is that 50% of the global population growth which is going to take place from the 2024 till the year of 2050, it actually 50% of this growth will take place only in 9 countries and the highest of that will take place in our country. So almost 7 in the 10 people will be actually living in the urban areas by the year of 2050. If we look at the world's number, it will be around close to 60%, a bit more than that. Almost 50% of India's population will be living in the urban cities, which is currently held to be across close to 30%. If you look at the developed nations like Japan, UK, US, it can go up to 80% of their population living in these cities. Now let's try to examine the status of urbanization which has taken place in our country. So in the absence of the census 2021, we actually lack any precise data on our current urban population. Basically, there is a kind of an estimation which has been done by World Bank, according to which currently India's population which live in urban areas, that is around 40%, and we have around 9,000 statutory and census towns. So if you look at specifically the data which has been provided to us by census 2011, there exist around 4,041 statutory towns and around 3,894 census towns. We will understand the difference between them, but first look at the kind of the growth which we have incurred from the year of 1951 onwards. So in the year of 1951, around 17% of our population was living in urban cities. By the year of 1991, that actually reached to 25%. And then by the year of census 2011, it has already reached to 31%, which according to World Bank is now approximately around 40%. What is the difference which exists between the statutory towns and the census town? So a statutory town is basically a town which consists of kind of governing bodies like municipality, corporation, a kind of a cantonment board or a military area or a notified town area committee. However, a census town has certain specific urban characteristics such as, for example, it has at least more than 5,000 of population. At least 75% of its male working population, just a hint of patriarchy, is actually working in non-agricultural activities, and the population density is or above around 400 people per kilometer square. Now, what are the issues which actually exist with this urbanization phenomena as highlighted by the today's news? The first is obviously that because of various push and pull factors, these urban agglomerations has actually entailed such an unsustainable population which is actually kind of acting as a burden on the resources of these cities. What are these push and pull factors? So let's say, for example, if the World Bank states that these census towns which we're discussing about, they are currently producing 70% of our country's GDP. So obviously they are acting as a kind of a major hub for various kind of economic activities and industrialization, and thus obviously they provide better health and educational infrastructure, which is also reflected in various kind of data. Such as, for example, if you look at the health dynamic of India 2023, 40% of the rural health center does not have a basic component, and that is the building. So obviously that will act as a kind of a push factor from the village areas, the lack of healthcare facilities. Second is, if you look at the All India Survey on Higher Education 2023 released by the Ministry of Education, currently 43% of universities and 61% of the colleges, they do reside in rural India, but the quality of education and infrastructure, specifically catering to the need of the industry 4.0, because there is complete absence of that in the rural India. The students, they are actually venturing or moving away from these rural areas to the urban areas or to the higher education in these areas. For example, you guys can compare the kind of enrollment forms which are filled for Delhi University and for any small college in the small town in which you are living. Or if you look at the data provided to us by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, as of April 2024, even though if you look at the unemployment rate, that is high in urban areas, that is 8.7%, in comparison to the unemployment rate in rural India, which is around 7.8%, but the quality of jobs which are being offered in the urban areas, the kind of higher income prospect, that actually attracts a lot of people, and this large scale internal migration actually transpires to this unsustainable population. Just look at a staggering number of the population which resides in the cities of Delhi and Bombay, 34 million and 22 million respectively. Keep this in mind that these two cities has more population than countries like Malaysia, Netherlands, Romania. So just imagine that some cities of our country have more population than the whole countries. Then there are certain other issues. One of that is, because of such large scale migration which has taken place, it has eventually led to unplanned urbanization as per the Niti Aayog's India at 75 report. Because remember the more than 4,000 census towns which we were discussing? As per the Niti Aayog report, 65% of them does not have any kind of master plan. So just imagine creating the house of your dream without any architectural plan. Even if these cities have got some kind of master plans, they are actually based upon archaic laws and outdated models, and thus they are incapable to actually deal with these growing issues. For example, the model plan which exists for Delhi, on the basis of which the drainage system which has been created, that is actually based on the 1962 model plan, which was actually originally designed to sustain a population of 5 million. Just look at the kind of population which Delhi has now. Then, let's say as a district magistrate in the future, if you actually want to solve this particular problem, you want to create some new initiative, you will actually face a lot of implementation challenges. There are two prominent. First is the web of bylaws and development regulations which exist, such as, for example, the Model Building Code of 2016. The next is that, let's say for example, you want to start by renovation of a particular colony, a colony which has got more than 500 jhuggis and jhopadis. You actually want to create a kind of a residential apartment here under your Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. Now to do that, you will actually indulge yourself in the procuring of property first, and then that will lead to a lot of legal challenges. First of all, a lot of people in our country do not have sound legal documents, legal property documents. Then the kind of legal issues which will actually arise, property being a legal right under Article 300A of the Constitution. So because of these unplanned urbanization, it has actually led to what? The ghettoization or the proliferation of slums in our country. Just look at the staggering number of people who actually lives in slums in these urban cities, that is 49%. And if we compare it to the data of 2002, only 6% improvement has actually been done. So basically in these urban cities, there exists a kind of a socio-spatial hierarchy where either there are gated cities, a different world altogether, or there exists a lot of slums where we actually faces a lot of health problems, if you guys can recall from the previous Analyst. Then all of these rising population, vehicular emission, concretization, the industrial emissions, all of that has led to a large scale pollution. Just look at the air quality index. So anywhere above 200 is actually considered the air to be in the poor category, which can actually lead you to a lot of cardiovascular diseases. Just look at the number of cities and their air quality value on the 1st of November. Also, because of this concretization which has taken place, the large scale construction, obviously unplanned, these building materials, as for example concrete and asphalt, they absorb and trap heat, heating up the cities, ultimately leading to the risk of cardiovascular diseases, heat stroke, sunstroke, dehydration, the urban heat island effect, which you guys quite often hear about. So you guys might say hi to your Auschwitz fellows, something like that, the kind of gas chambers in which we are living in these cities. One thing could have solved this problem, and that could have been a decentralized urban governance. However, the article today specifically highlights that there exists a poor state of this urban local governance. That despite the constitutional mandate which has been given to these urban local bodies under the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1992, most of these urban local bodies are actually being controlled by undemocratic bodies like private entities or parastatals. For example, only 3 out of the 18 functions which were actually devolved or devoluted to these urban local bodies under your 12th schedule of the Constitution, only 3 of them has been universally transferred to these governments. Also, these cities receive only 0.5% of the GDP in the intergovernmental transfers. These cities which we are considering as the economic hub. Or just look at the less share of their own tax revenue, that is less than 20%. Almost 60% they are dependent on the total central and state transfers, and non-tax revenue comprises of the least of the 20%. So what can be actually done, or what has been the government's response to tackle with these issues of urbanization? First of all, the government has tried to create a sustainable livelihood, following the idea of Sustainable Development Goal 11, which actually deals with to make cities inclusive and sustainable. Then the idea of Urban October was launched by UN Habitat to actually deal with these growing challenges back in the year of 2015 itself. There was a new urban agenda which was actually adopted in Habitat 3. Habitat 3 which basically took place at Quito. Quito is basically the capital of Ecuador, and that was actually agreed by 193 parties of the UN Habitat, India being one of them. Then to further actually increase the livelihood condition, make them sustainable, the government came up with Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, where more than 85 lakh Pakka houses has been created. Also, the kind of regular water supply, drinking water supply is being provided to them under the Jal Jeevan Mission. Then the Amrut Mission has been created for sustainable kind of drainage system, as well as your National Urban Livelihood Mission and National Urban Digital Mission further takes a step to actually enhance the living conditions of these people. So the idea is that we will actually be able to transform these slum dwelling peoples into the people who are actually living sustainably in the cities. Then there are certain urban transformation strategies which we can actually adopt. Recently, the government launched an e-bus Seva scheme. Then the idea is to actually launch a rapid transit system. One of them is actually coming into the fruition, that is being created from the city of Meerut to the National Capital Territory of Delhi. The idea is that, let's say this is point A and this is point B. What if we create a fast moving metro line from Meerut to Delhi? So the people who are living in Meerut, they can just travel on daily basis to Delhi through a public transport. Obviously, that will lead to less carbon dioxide emission, as well as they will not need to reside in this region to go for their job. The same connected idea is a transit-oriented development system. So the idea is that, let's say if I'm coming out of the metro station, reaching to Delhi, the working place or the economic activities shall be created within the vicinity of that. The reason to actually reduce down the greenhouse gas emission. Then if you guys can recall from the previous analysis, we discussed about the high performance building. So these are basically electrically smart buildings, such as for example, we can take the buildings of Noida. So the kind of artificial shading is being provided to this particular building from the sun. So the idea is that the building will actually warm up less, so it will trap less amount of heat. Thus the requirement of air condition will actually reduce down. So the electricity consumption will reduce down as well. So we can actually create such kind of high performance building, as well as to reduce down the concretization, we can actually adopt urban afforestation methods like Miyawaki method. Also, we can strengthen the urban local bodies as following the directive of the 15th Finance Commission, which actually provided the grant of more than 25,000 crore to these urban local bodies. And the government has also come up with urban platform for delivery of online governance or UPYOG. So you guys can actually use all of these schemes whenever you guys are tackling with the issue of urbanization or a question appears on that. Also try to solve this practice question, and we move forward to the next news. Where in light of India hosting the first Asian Buddhist Summit in New Delhi, the article actually puts impetus on using Buddhism as a tool of soft power. Soft power, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the theme of international relations. Basically, there is a kind of a growing claim between the Asian countries to actually claim Buddhism as a tool of socio-cultural ties, to claim the Buddhist heritage. One of the players is India as well. The idea is that India shall be considered as the birthplace of Buddhism, a kind of a claim which is actually made by our neighboring country Nepal as well. So let's first try to understand that who was Gautam Buddha. If we refer to a Buddhist text called as Brahmajal Sutta, there existed 63 school of philosophies in our country at one point of time during the Mahajanpada period, that is basically 6th to 5th century BC. 63 school of philosophies. You guys can see the evidence from the term called as Kutagrashala from your ancient books. Kutagrashala, where the kind of debate used to take place among these philosophical schools. One of the tradition of these school was Shraman tradition, which basically existed as a kind of an antithesis to the established Vedic traditions of rituals and sacrifices. And the Shraman traditions basically formed the schools like Ajivikas, Jainism, and the Buddhism, which was actually founded by a prince called as Siddharth or Gautam Buddha, who is supposed to live between 563 to 483 BC, thus making him contemporary of some kings of that time, very important kings, like for example Bimbisara and Ajatashatru of Haranka dynasty, Prasenjit of Kaushala, Udyayana of Vatsa. Now, the Lumbini pillar inscription of Ashoka, who was the third Mauryan king and supposed to be ruled from 268 to 232 BC, and this Lumbini pillar inscription was actually inscribed in the 20th year of his ruling, so maybe around 248 BC. It basically considered Lumbini, which is basically in Nepal, as the birthplace of Shakya Muni or the Gautam Buddha. Now, why Gautam Buddha is actually being referred as Shakya Muni here? Because he was basically born in the Shakya clan to the king Sudhodana. Shakya clan was basically the part of the larger Kaushala Mahajanpada. So, the king Sudhodana was actually worried because of the prophecy which was made by the chief priest Asita. Asita has said that this small kid will either become the greatest king of all time, or for example, he will become the greatest monk. So being worried of this prophecy, Sudhodana actually sheltered Gautam Buddha within the palace itself with all the luxuries of the world. But if we refer to the Buddhist text of Digh Nikaya, it was at the age of 29 years when, because of his curiosity, the Gautam Buddha actually wanders away from the place and he sees four visuals which are basically termed as Chatro Mahanimitta, which change his perspective towards his life. What were these four visuals? So the first, he saw an old person and he realized that all of us are aging. So sorry to break it to you, but while you have been watching this lecture, the total amount of time you guys have on this planet Earth, some of that time has been passed away. Then he saw basically a kind of a sick person. So he realized that all of us are suffering from one disease or another. So for example, some of you guys might be suffering from the disease of scrolling on internet. Some of you guys might be suffering from the disease of self-doubt during this preparation. Then he basically saw a corpse and he realized that death is the ultimate reality. And then he saw a wanderer, a monk or a pravajaka, who was basically, despite these odds and externalities, he had given up on the materialistic world and he was actually aspiring for the higher spiritual liberation. Thus, Gautam Buddha actually went through a process called as samvega, or a kind of an internal burning or a spiritual urgency to actually discover this path of liberation. And thus he wanders away from his palace. That event is called as Mahabhinishkraman, where he is accompanied by his charioteer, whose name was Channa or Chandaka, on the horse named Kanthaka. And thus, for the next 6 years, so he left the home at 29 years. For the next 6 years, he wanders across the country for the search of the true knowledge, where he actually comes across various spiritual teachers. The first spiritual teacher of Gautam Buddha was basically Alari Kalama. And finally, he reaches to a place called as Bodh Gaya. Bodh Gaya at that time used to be called as Uruvela, and it was on the bank of Fagun river, where Gautam Buddha eventually sits down under the peepal tree and he meditates for the next 49 days or 7 weeks, during which he is also tempted by Mara, which basically symbolizes the various kind of desires. And in the kind of refutation of that, he actually does the very famous Bhumi Sparsh Mudra, which was also asked in your UPSC prelims examination, where he actually calls upon the earth to witness his purity. And after that, he actually gets enlightenment when he realizes Arya Sachani, or the Four Noble Truths. What are these Four Noble Truths? The first is that Sabbam Dukkham, everyone is sad. Each one of us is suffering from one disease or another. Is there a cause of this suffering? Yes, absolutely. The cause of suffering is termed as Samudaya. The samudaya, which is basically caused by tanha, or the desire or attachment to any being or a kind of a thing, right? Any materialistic desire as well. So is there a way to cease this suffering? Yes, absolutely. And that is called as nirodh, right? So where you can actually cease your desire, you can let your desire go away. And for that purpose, the Buddha actually laid down an 8-fold noble path called as Ashtangika Marg, and thus he gained the enlightenment called as Nirvana. So he became Tathagat, one who has thus gone. Tathagat and Shakyamuni, two terms which are actually ascribed to Gautam Buddha. Then he wanders and he reaches to this Sarnath Park. Sarnath Park in the region of modern day Varanasi, where he actually gives his first sermon, shares his learning with his first 5 followers. Who were them? They were basically KBVAM, that is Kaundinya, Bhadrika, Vashpa, Ashwajit and Mahanaman. And that basically leads to the event called as Dham Chakra Parvartana. That is basically the turning of the righteousness path, because earlier it used to be on the basis of Vedic tradition, but now it is based upon the Buddha's teaching. So basically the major events of Buddha, such as for example Mahabhinishkraman, the attainment of Nirvana, the Dham Chakra Parvartana, all of that took place where? In our country itself. And that is why India has a rightful claim to say that India is the birthplace of Buddhism. Then comes your third Mauryan king, Ashoka, about whom we were discussing. He organizes a council, the third Buddhist council of that time, which basically took place at Pataliputra, which was actually preceded or chaired by Mowgli Putta Tissa. You guys can note down all this important information. So he actually leads down to spread of the message of Buddhism across the country by creating various Ashokan inscriptions. One of them being the Lumbini pillar inscription as well as spreading the messages of Buddhism across the world, such as for example after this third Buddhist council, which basically took place in the year of 250 BC, Ashoka sent various Buddhist monks across the world to spread the messages, such as for example Maharakhita was sent to Yona, which was basically the kind of West Asia. The Majhantika was sent to the region of Gandhara. Mahadev was sent to the Mahish Mandala, or the central provinces of modern time. Rakhita was sent to Vanavasi. Sona and Uttara was sent to Swarnbhumi, or maybe the Southeast Asia, the region of Myanmar. And Mahinda was sent to the Sri Lanka. So basically that led to the spread of Buddhism from our country across the world. Thus, as a country, we have a lot of potential to use this Buddhism as a tool of soft diplomacy or soft power. First, let's try to understand what is this concept of soft power, which was basically conceptualized by Joseph Nye in the year of 1990s. So Joseph Nye's prediction was that the hard power, the traditional hard power, which is basically based on the military might, that will not be the sole deciding power in the international relations in the future. The reason for them being is the kind of advancements which every other country is making in the weapon system and the proliferation of nuclear power. Thus, the socio-cultural ties which one country shares with other country, that will become much more important, and that was the idea of soft power, which was actually inscribed in our foreign diplomacy through the Panchshil principle of 1954, which we adopted along with the China. The major idea of that being the idea of peaceful coexistence, which also reflects in the idea of Buddhism. The idea of Buddhism, such as, for example, non-violence or ahimsa and non-materialism, which these ideas actually became quite popular after the events of World War II, and that gained global traction among the countries. Various Southeast Asian countries started claiming their lost Buddhist heritage once again. And thus, if the 97% of the Buddhist population lives in these Asian countries, such as, for example, look at the population in Thailand, in Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, even in our country, the 9th largest population of Buddhists resides. The idea is that the Buddhism forms a major component of our Act East policy as well as our neighborhood first policy, because our major neighbors, like for example Bhutan, Myanmar and Sri Lanka, they claim this Buddhist ideology to be a greater part of their national identity. Now, just like every other political sphere of significance where we are facing challenges from China, China has not left us alone even in this reason of Buddhist diplomacy, and it is claiming its own right on Buddhism, which is basically the extension of its wolf warrior diplomacy. So it is basically trying to add up the religious overtone to its already existing linguistic and cultural policy as well. First, let's try to understand the kind of borderland complex which China had at earlier times, and that led to the major propagation of Buddhism in China. So for example, you guys might have heard about a lot of fans of K-pop culture, which we have in our country in current time, right? Watching Korean dramas and all, singing their songs. But even then, we have complete lack of understanding about the Korean culture and ancient history. So obviously that will make one curious. That exactly what started happening in China. So the religion of Buddhism is spread in China through the trade routes of Silk Route. But the people of China were quite unaware about the kind of historical traditions and values of Buddhism. So various Chinese travelers came to our country, such as for example Faxian, who was in our country from 399 to 411 CE during the time of Chandragupta II. Or for example Zhuangzan, who came during the Pushya-Bhuti dynasty ruler Harshvardhana, and he was in our country from 629 to 643 CE. Then that led to the kind of spread of Buddhist ideology in China. And its major claim today resides that even today more than 245 million of its population is majorly Buddhist. That actually comprises 30% of the population, even though it is majorly confined to the south and east region. Currently, China has 28,000 Buddhist monasteries and 16,000 temples. The major idea is that China is actually using this Buddhist diplomacy to provide legitimacy to its Belt and Road Initiative. Because when it was constructing infrastructure in the region of Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, it actually used the Buddhist narratives there as well. Also, obviously this Buddhist diplomacy acts as a major tool for its tourism sector, provides impetus to that, a major source of income. And thus, when the Dalai Lama, who actually fled to India in the year of 1959 and asked for us to the shelter, and he is considered as the major propagator of Theravada Buddhism, another strong kind of argument which we have to claim on the Buddhist diplomacy. China has been conflicting perspective on Dalai Lama, and it has actually asked several countries this year itself to not issue visa or travel permission to Dalai Lama. Or if there is kind of any Buddhist conference which we are holding, and Dalai Lama is participating in that, China is trying to oppose that as much as he can. So to actually spread our ancient heritage, make people aware about it, the Buddhists being born in our country, what are the steps which has been taken by our country? So in 1952, the International Buddhist Conference at Sachi took place during the Prime Ministership of Jawaharlal Nehru. Then we held a kind of a global Buddhist congregation in 2011. We started creating Buddhist tourist circuit in 2015. Just look for example, at Saraswati, then at Kushinagar, then the Deer Park, which we guys are talking about, the place of Buddha's enlightenment. The Buddha descended from Tushita heaven after teaching his mother at this place at Sankashya. You guys can note that down. Then very recently we have created India International Center for Buddhist Culture at Lumbini in Nepal in 2022. In 23 we actually provided 15 million grants to Sri Lanka to promote Buddhist ties. The Delhi Summit of 2023 which took place, where we organized on Buddhism, 171 foreign delegates from Buddhist countries actually joined. As well as we have very recently established the Nalanda University of 2024. Can any one of you tell me that Nalanda University was established by which Gupta ruler in the comment box? So these are the steps which India has taken. But what India can do further? So the article highlights that we shall actually do a lot of cultural events to showcase our Buddhist history. And in this way, we can actually utilize the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. We need to further strengthen our ties with the Buddhist leaders and organizations worldwide. Also, we need to align the Buddhist teaching with this motto of Vasudev Kutumbakam, that is, whole earth is one family. So we need to align that as well. We need to propagate Buddhist ideas from our platforms. And for that purpose, we actually need to exploit the Indian movies reach worldwide. Because if you will look at the Hollywood movies, the Buddhist culture is actually reflected primarily from the region of China itself. So there is a complete absence of that, and that is the area we should also work upon. So consider these suggestions, try to attempt this particular question, and we move forward to the next piece, where we are going to analyze a very interesting editorial which has come today talking about that where India has actually went wrong in the manufacturing sector. The article basically starts with a kind of a paradox. The idea is that there exists a kind of an autocracy, which China is. So China has been able to deliver a strong wage growth but has been unable to a weak public market shareholder returns, which is minus 13% in the last 20 years. But a democracy like our country has actually delivered strong public market shareholder returns, that is 13,000% in the last 20 years, but we have weak wage growth when it comes to the labor employed in our country. So the idea is that changing our future requires more manufacturing jobs and obviously high productivity firms. The kind of an argument which you guys might be hearing very often in the news. Let's first start with comparing India and China's economy in the last 30 years time span. In 1990, both India and China were at the lowest rungs. Just look in 10 years the kind of exponential growth which China had in terms of GDP in current US dollars, from being 394 to reaching 17,963. Or for example, GDP per capita, just look at being at 360, 347 around and just reaching to 12,720. In comparison to that, just look at a kind of a slow, sluggish growth which India had over a period of time. Currently, China is the second largest economy in the world and India is trailing behind at fifth largest economy in the world. So the article basically starts by stating that India has indeed made a remarkable progress if we compare ourselves where we were standing back in the year of 1947. For example, we have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of a hierarchical society. We have raised our life expectancy from 31 to 68 years. There was a point of time when almost 9 out of 11 people were illiterate and we have brought that down to 1 out of 11. The GDP has actually reached to a staggering $3.95 trillion. We are also aspiring to become a 5 trillion economy very soon by the year of 2027. As per the IMF, our economy is currently growing at a 7% growth rate. And if you look at service and industry share, that is around 80% in this total GDP production. The gross capital formation actually exists at 30% of the GDP, but the article suggests that there also exist a lot of challenges. What are they? They say that the social mobility is actually 40% lower in the middle income countries than the high income countries. So currently there are 108 middle income countries which are aiming to reach the high income status. But they shall understand that the 34 middle income economies which basically transition to the high income status since the year of 1990, basically in the last 3 decades, they had only 250 million people. So they were very small economies. 250 million people, which has basically the kind of the population of our one state at today's time, and that is Uttar Pradesh. So what are the challenges which we are facing? The challenges are the employed poverty. So it's not only the unemployment rate which we were discussing as per the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, but also the people who are employed, they have very less wage growth. Their nominal wage is increasing, but the inflation is also increasing at the very same rate. So for example, only 11% of our labor force is actually in manufacturing, which is labor intensive. 14% is in construction. 45% is in agriculture and 30% is in services. Tragically, most farmers dwell in this self-exploitation of the self-employment, and they are also considered as employed people. So why India has not moved millions from the farms to factories since 1991? The article suggests that we do not have shortage of three factors of production, the three prominent factors. First is land. So every Indian household could get half an acre and fit in Rajasthan and Haryana. If we talk about labor, 30% there is employed poverty. So we obviously have a large workforce. It's not like we don't have labor. Or for example, if we come to capital, 50% of our total foreign direct investment since our independent year has actually come in the last 5 years. So our economy is also growing. If we see, for example, the Hindu rate of growth which we had, marked by the slow rate of growth between 1960s to 1980s. Now we have reached to 7% of growth. We are one of the fastest growing economies. But obviously this wealth is being accumulated in few hands and not being transferred to the larger population. That is the challenge of the employed poverty, right? So the idea is that what if we look at the data which talk about the unemployed rate, or for example even at the skilling of the people. So currently look at the high level of unemployment which we have per 1000 people. That is almost 191 in Bihar, or for example in Rajasthan that exists to 285. So these many people are remaining unemployed. Even let's say for example there exists a kind of a frictional unemployment because these people does not have a skill set which is actually required to get the job, such as for example if you look at the Skill India mission, a report was published, India Skill Report of 2021, which argued that half of the India's graduates which are coming from these colleges are unemployable. They do not have the skill which is required for Industry 4.0. And the open unemployment was around 2.1% in 2012. That has actually tripled to 6.1% in 2018. That is highest in the 45 years. What has been the government's response? Let's look at that as well. So the government tried to boost our manufacturing sector by creating production linked and design linked incentive scheme. It also tried to put actually research to create the kind of products which are required for Industry 4.0. For that purpose, we are trying to promote research in the state universities through your Anusandhan National Research Foundation, or to promote the startup and entrepreneurship culture by creating fund of funds, skilling the population under your Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0, creating the first national database for unorganized workers to provide them social security benefit under your e-Shram portal. In your budget 2024, the government has also agreed that now we'll provide kind of a wage subsidy to the first-time employers, right? So if you will get first-time employment, the government will say that if your salary is less than 1 lakh, we will provide you some wage subsidy. That is your employment-linked incentive scheme. Then the government is trying to actually put impetus on rural and traditional workers by creating entrepreneurship in non-farm sectors in the rural areas through Pradhan Mantri Employment Generation Program. All of these steps are being taken by the government of India. The article suggests that there are certain steps which has to be taken. First is that we need to create employment in the labor-intensive manufacturing sector, such as for example, attracting factories require a policy shift from India's bird eye to the warm eye view of the daily life of employment. So the change has started beginning, such as for example, with proposals like Jan Vishwas 2.0, Enterprise DigiLocker, and the National Open Compliance Grid as well. This shall be followed by adopting labor codes, creating competition for social security monopolies like EPF and ESI, Employment Provident Fund, and reducing the irrational statutory gap which exists between the kind of gross and net salaries for the low wage employees. Then the article suggests that we shall actually put a lot of smart policy for Make for India. So we can start just giving some small components and products to the cheap markets, importing from there, providing them tariffs and non-tariff incentives as well. Then there shall be policy nudges which shall be taken to actually enhance the market. So these are the suggestions which has been provided by the government. And with this, we move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk about the kind of boost which has been taken place in India and Iran ties in the light of the recent BRICS summit, the 16th BRICS summit, which actually was hosted by Russia in the Kazan. And there was a kind of a meeting which India took place with Iran, both close civilizational friends and looking to strengthen a stagnating partnership. Why? The reason is that Iran is now embroiled in the war in Gaza with Israel, and it is actually looking for India's support to de-escalate the crisis as per the editorial. India too has supported having a ceasefire and de-escalation at the earliest. right? That actually emphasize on India's role as a balancing power in the world of geopolitics. First, let's try to have a quick overlook at what does we mean by BRICS. So BRICS is basically a kind of an acronym, an informal grouping which exists between Brazil, Russia, India and China. The first leader summit actually took place in the year of 2009. Then South Africa joined in 2010, giving the acronym its complete name, that is BRICS. And the idea was to actually counter the prevailing world order, which was actually led by Bretton Woods institutions, dominated by basically the G7 countries. Bretton Woods institutions such as, for example, IMF, World Bank, etc. Very recently, because of the growing traction of the BRICS, some new members has joined, such as, for example, Ethiopia and Egypt from Africa, and Saudi Arabia, Iran and UAE from West Asia. What is the economic potential of the BRICS? So currently it holds 41% of the world population, 31% of the global GDP and 18% of the global trade. Remember BRICS, remember 41, 31, 81, 18. Then what is the potential of India and Iran relationship in the future? The idea is that the key role which is being played by India in 2023 in Iran's entry into two major organizations. First is Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the other is BRICS. So the idea is to actually discuss further the possibility of strengthening cooperation in key areas. One of them is Chabahar Port and the other is International North-South Transport Corridor. You guys can see the INSTC here, which actually starts from Bombay in our country, moves to Bandar Abbas in the region of Iran, that is the port. Then it crosses through the Central Asian regions and ultimately reaches to Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. And it comprises of maritime, canal, roads and rail networks. Then earlier, before the kind of sanctions which were actually put on Iran by USA because of the nuclear proliferation issue, before that Iran used to be actually a major oil supplier for our country. And it has vast reserves of crude oil and natural gas, accounting for 24% of the oil reserves of West Asia and 12% of the world. However, after the sanctions, India actually moved towards other countries, try to look for alternative sources because of the cheaper oil cost, such as, for example, the top oil supplier for India in fiscal year 23 was Russia, followed by Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE and USA. Another major reason can be for the close partnership is the Chabahar port, in which India has actually invested a lot, which can act as a driving force of bilateral relationship. Very recently, there is a kind of a 10-year contract which we have signed for the operation of port. Why? Because it provides us easy and short access to India's Kandla and Bombay airport. And it is located because outside the Strait of Hormuz, it actually insulates India's trade from any threat of closure of sea lanes due to the conflict which was taking place in the Persian Gulf region. For example, the attacks which were being done by the Houthi rebels. So just look at here the Kandla airport. It will connect here in the region of Gulf of Oman to the Chabahar port. From there, we can actually create rail and road network through Afghanistan to the Central Asian region, because Pakistan is blocking us for that, being a neighboring country. So there is a railway link of 700 km between Chabahar to the Zahedan city, which is being fast-tracked to be connected later to the railway network of Iran. And a further road link from the Zahedan to the Jaranj in Afghanistan could provide seamless connectivity for humanitarian aid from India to Afghanistan. Before 2019, obviously Iran was supplying us 12% of our India's oil need, as we were discussing, and because now the bilateral ties are again on the track, oil and gas import could actually recommence from Iran, which will actually open up a new range of possibilities for our country. And for that purpose, India-Oman actually gas pipeline, Iran-Oman-India gas pipeline has been under discussion in 1993, and in May 2022, Iran and Oman actually agreed to develop 2 undersea gas pipelines and oil field along their maritime borders. So that will actually cut down the cost of imported inflation because of these gas pipelines if we are going to create. Then the idea is that the energy cooperation and defense ties are just some of the possibilities. We can further explore that through the military cooperation, such as, for example, the defense cooperation agreement which we signed in 2001. However, that has remained toothless because of the sanctions which were put on Iran. Then in India's Milan 2024 exercise, Iran warship Dana participated. There is a kind of a military exercise which we conduct with Iran. The name of that is Bharat Shakti, noted down. Then the Iran has recently developed lot of modern day warfare weapon systems, as for example armed drones and ballistic missiles. So India can procure that. It can lead to technology transfer as well, and both the countries can actually work together to neutralize the terror groups in Pakistan. If it comes to the aspect of diplomacy, there are certain ties here and there, specifically India's stand on the issue of Palestine. But India has followed the de-hyphenate policy, where we actually seclude ourselves from these controversial methods and engage bilaterally with the country. We have to keep in our mind that Iran forms an integral component of our Look West policy, and thus we need to strengthen our ties with Iran. And how we will do that? Through the platforms of BRICS and SCO ties. So keep these things in your mind, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk about a very interesting paradox. The paradox is about the stagnating rural wages which exist, which appeared in your explained section of Indian Express. First, let's try to understand the kind of growth rate which our economy had. So for example, we were growing at an annual rate of 4.6% from 2019 to 2023 and 2024. And currently in the last 3 fiscal years, we have grown at the rate of 7.8%. This is our whole country's GDP growth. If we compare that with our farm sector growth, that has been around 4.2 and 3.6%. So 4.2% from 2019 to 24. However, these macro growth numbers are actually not reflected in the rural wages. So obviously, if the economy is growing, the rural wages shall also increase. Now, first let's try to understand that how this rural wage is actually calculated. So the Labor Bureau, it actually compiles a daily wage rate data for 25 agricultural and non-agricultural occupations collected every month from 600 sample villages, which are actually spread across 20 states. The wage growth has been estimated in both nominal value, that is current value, and real value, that is basically deducing the annual inflation based on the consumer price index of rural India, and for all rural as well as agriculture occupation. Which are the occupations which are actually included in this? So it includes your ploughing, tilling, sowing, harvesting, picking of commercial crops, horticulture crops, or animal husbandry, etc. What is the difference between a nominal income and a real income? Let's try to understand that. So let's say if currently, back in the year of 2018, my nominal income used to be around 100 rupees. And in that 100 rupees, I was able to afford a 80 rupees iPhone. I know this goes far away from the reality, but just bear with me. Now, let's say that in 2024, my nominal income, that is basically the income which I am getting in my hand, that has increased to 150 rupees. I seem to be quite rich. But because of the artificial demand for such products like iPhone, the price of iPhone, because of the inflationary forces, has reached to or doubled down to 160. So now with my current nominal income, I am not able to afford the same product which I was able back in 2018. So basically in my nominal income, when I also calculate the inflation which exists, that gives me the idea of my real wage increase which has done. So this is basically in the minus currently. And how this inflation is being calculated in the rural area? Through the CPI rural released by Ministry of Labor Bureau. Now the wage growth is estimated in nominal and real, that we have understood. The idea is that the average nominal year-on-year growth in the rural wages during the 5 years, it actually was around 5.2%. And it was around 5.8% for the agricultural wages. But if we adjust it with the inflation, it is actually minus 4% for rural areas and 0.2% for agricultural wages. Just like how my income declined in comparison to 2018-24, same thing happened with the rural areas. It actually declined to 0.4%. So just look at the nominal wage if we are talking about in the 5-year time period. See, it is increasing here, then obviously declined during the pandemic time, and then it has just been restored to around 5.81%. If we talk about the real wage, just look at here. It used to be around 2.13, currently it is 1.65%. So even for the current fiscal year, the overall rural wages have risen only 5.4% year-on-year basis. And if we talk, just add it with the inflation is around 5.1%. So the real increase is around 0.5%. The idea is that why the rural wages has remained stagnant across the years and has not actually declined. There are two major reasons. First is the rising labor force participation rates, specifically among the women, a concept which is called as feminization of agriculture. Idea is, what is first is LFPR, or the labor force participation rate. It is basically the percentage of the population which is aged 15 years and above, and that is actually working or seeking to work for a relatively long period of a particular year. The all India average female FPR used to be 24.5% in 2018. In the 5 years, it has actually increased to 41.7% as per the recent periodic labor force survey for 2023-2024. If we look at the rural female LFPR, it used to be 26% in 2019. In 5 years, it has reached to 47.6%. So almost 20% increase has been done. Now, if you look at the Finance Ministry's economic survey which was released, it says that this increasing female LFPR in the rural areas, it actually has been done because of the policies which has been taken by the government, such as, for example, the Ujjwala Yojana, Har Ghar Jal Yojana, Saubhagya scheme or Swachh Bharat scheme. Why? Because of these schemes, there has been expanded household access to the clean cooking fuel, electricity, piped drinking water, and toilets. So that has actually freed up the rural women's time and effort. And yes, that is indeed a possibility, because you guys might have heard about a concept called as Pani Patni culture which exists in Maharashtra. So what happens that in the rural villages of Maharashtra affected by the drought, the people actually marries a lot of women so that they can go to distance and fetch water. But now if they are getting water, let's say under Har Ghar Jal Yojana, so they have a free time and thus they are getting employed in this agriculture area. Second is that even though this has been done, the major issue is that this is a less labor intensive growth. So the rural female LFPR has actually soared, but the agriculture share in the employment of this workforce has increased from 71% to 76% only. Thus, although more women are entering the rural labor force, they are working only in the farm itself, thus as a disguised unemployment. And the movement is from home to field and not from factory or office. So the economy may be churning out more goods and services, but that process is becoming increasingly capital intensive and labor saving, right? So what is the idea? The idea is that this is a sector where marginal productivity or output per worker is actually low. So the supply of more labor will need to what? It will further depress down the wages. Now the fact that rural non-agriculture wages has actually grown less, it has actually fallen in real terms, it shows the worst picture for the non-farm labor demand which exists in the rural areas. What we can do? We need to focus upon the fast moving consumer goods, home appliances, durables and two-wheeler makers. The reason being that they are more labor intensive and consumption driven. Also, the income transfer schemes of the government has come in the aid as well. So for example, PM Kisan Samman Nidhi, under which 6,000 per year income transfer to around 11 crore farmer households are provided. Then there are certain state schemes like, for example, Maharashtra government's Ladki Bahin Yojana, which you guys can use in your answer, which transfers 1,500 rupees per month to women from families which has annual income less than 2.5 lakh. So these are the certain steps which has been taken and which can be taken, specifically focusing upon the labor intensive industries. So keep these facts in your mind and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk about the recent findings of Aditya L1 mission and see what this Aditya L1 mission is actually about. First, let's try to understand what is Aditya L1 mission. Aditya L1 mission was basically India's first space-based observatory class solar mission, and it was launched on PSLV XL by ISRO. The idea was to actually deploy this satellite at L1 point where it can actually view the sun without any eclipse. Let's first try to understand what does this L1 point actually stands for. So let's say, for example, here is Earth, here is sun, here is this Lagrange point where basically the Aditya L1 is parked. There exist such 5 Lagrange points. What are these Lagrangian points? They are basically the positions in the space where the gravitational force of two body systems, let's say for example Earth and Sun, it creates a kind of a pocket of gravitational equilibrium. So basically this can be used by the spacecraft to be docked in a single position without requiring any kind of external fuel. Remember, there exist such 5 Lagrangian points and Aditya L1 is parked on L1. Now, what are the basically the Aditya L1's major objectives? The objective was to actually measure coronal heating and solar wind acceleration, to couple and dynamics of the solar atmosphere, to understand the solar wind distribution and temperature anisotropy, as well as the initiation of coronal mass ejection flares and what is its impact on the Earth's weather system. Now, the launch date was around 2nd of September. The time it took was around 4 months, and the payloads are these important payloads, one of them which we are going to discuss, and that is VELC. So remember this Aditya L1 missions, specifically the kind of objectives which we have discussed, what has been it found through the VELC, that is basically stands for Visible Emission Line Coronagraph, which was abroad Aditya L1, and it predicted basically the onset time of a coronal mass ejection on the sun. And this VELC has been developed by the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bangalore. What is this coronal mass ejection? So the sun is basically a kind of an active object and often spews vast quantities of plasma in violent eruptions which are called as coronal mass ejection. So just look here, this is the convective zone of the sun where the rapid heating of plasma, it creates a kind of a currents of heated and cool gas. Then here exists the radiative zone. So the energy created in the core, it diffuses slowly through this plasma. Comes your core where the sun generates its energy via the thermonuclear reactions which are taking place. And finally the corona, the outer layer, the sun's outer atmosphere which extends millions of kilometers in outer surface. And from this layer takes place a mass ejection, which is basically the vast eruption of billions of tons of plasma accompanying magnetic field from the sun's corona. And what is the impact of that? So obviously that can impact our radio communication. It can impact the astronauts in the space. It can actually impact the kind of navigation which we do using the kind of satellites. It can also decrease the directional drilling accuracy or induce geoelectric field and current here as well. So these are the kind of the possible events which can take place because of this coronal mass ejection. On the basis of this, try to solve this particular PYQ, a very interesting one. Comment your answers. And we move forward to the last news of the day, where we are actually going to look at certain very important data on climate change which has been provided to us in your Indian Express sector. The idea is that the people in the world are facing record-breaking threats to their well-being, health, and survival from climate change, as per a report which you guys can quote in your answer, and that is Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. What are the data? Data is that 48% of the world lands area is actually facing extreme drought condition. That is the second largest affected area since 1951. 60% of lands were affected last year itself by extreme rainfall, which unleashed floods and raised risk from various kind of water contamination disease. Then 151 million people actually face or experience food insecurity due to such extreme weather events. 512 billion people that actually led to potential labor hours. That loss of this much of labor hours that was worth $835 billion because of the extreme heat. Last year, the heat exposure, it put people engaging in outdoor physical activity at a risk of heat stress for a record high of 27.7% more hours than on average. The average person experienced 50 more days of dangerous temperature in 2023. And the hotter and drier weather conditions contributed to a 31% increase in the number of people exposed to dangerously high particulate matters, all of which forms an important component of the impact of climate change under your GS3 paper theme. So what has been the government of India's response? The government of India has taken a lot of steps to actually tackle this climate change, specifically being done because of the release of the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, etc. For example, the government launched Pradhan Mantri Kusum Yojana for actually kind of solarization of agricultural pumps to actually put impetus on renewable energy. Then it launched International Solar Alliance, where we are trying to actually create a kind of a solar grid connecting the countries. Also, to further put impetus on installation of rooftop solar panels, the government came up with Pradhan Mantri Surya Ghar Yojana. Then to put impetus on green hydrogen, the government came up with National Hydrogen Mission. Can anyone tell me what is exactly the quantity of green hydrogen which we are actually aspiring to produce by the year of 2030 under this National Hydrogen Mission? Then we have also launched the ethanol blending program, where we have actually achieved the target of 10% blending. Now we are aspiring for 20% blending by the year of 2025 itself. We have also joined the Global Biofuel Alliance. Under your Ujjwala Yojana, we are actually trying to put impetus on clean cooking fuel, and we are also trying to convert waste to wealth energy plants, where we are actually trying to use cattle dungs to create them into biofuel, thus reducing the methane emission. So all of these steps has been taken by the government of India under the larger initiative of Panch Amrit target. So remember these data, you guys can use them in your GS3 answer. Remember these schemes as well. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.